I'm Gareth Williams from the Policy Practice. I'm going to be talking about a study I recently carried out on the political economy of agriculture in Zambia. This was a pilot test for the development of the EC's Sectoral Political Economy Analysis tool. The study was a very quick scan of the sector based on less than 2 weeks of fieldwork. It only provides a partial view, but I think nevertheless demonstrates the utility of political economy analysis in generating interesting and operationally relevant findings. The paper and this presentation are structured around the same 5 headings that are set out in the Sector Political Economy Analysis tool. Starting with some background on how the sector is performing. Despite agriculture's potential as a growth driver and its clear role in poverty reduction and supporting rural livelihoods, agriculture is a sector whose performance has been lagging behind the economy as a whole. Over the period 2004 to 2009, agriculture grew at half the rate of the national economy. And the immediate cause of this has been the low productivity of rain-fed agriculture, farmers typically getting yields of up to 2 tonnes a hectare at most, which is about half the level that would be needed to make them internationally competitive. Government policies in the sector have been overwhelmingly focused on maize and 2 programs in particular: the Fertilizer Input Support Program, the FISP, and the Maize Purchasing Program of the Food Reserve Agency, the FRA. The Fertilizer Input Support Program distributes subsidized fertilizer to maize farmers through the network of cooperatives. The Food Reserve Agency was originally established to manage a national food security reserve, but in practice has become the main maize purchaser in Zambia, offering a guaranteed and highly favorable price. In 2010-2011, the FRA bought up 83% of the smallholder crop, and the 2 programs together accounted for a massive 75% of public expenditure in the sector since 2010. The 2 programs and their effects have been intensively studied and criticised. The subsidies that they provide have been shown to be ineffectively targeted and subject to leakage and waste. They've distorted prices and created opportunities for rent-seeking and corruption, and also imposed a massive fiscal cost, taking away resources from alternative uses. With all of this spending essentially going on private goods, public goods provision in agriculture, in particular areas like agricultural research and extension or transport and market infrastructure, have been woefully neglected. And another damaging aspect of the current policies is that the private sector is being squeezed out. There's very little space for private traders to operate in maize marketing. And finally, there's evidence that the net effect of these policies has been to raise urban food prices. Just to highlight a couple of the main features of the institutional framework in the sector. The main line ministry, the Ministry of Agriculture and Cooperatives, is known to be weak, is subject to executive interference and suffers from a fragmentation of its functions. The bulk of the ministry's budget relates to expenditures on the FISP and the FRA, but these items are essentially controlled by State House and are outside the ministry's control. Looking back at the history of the sector and key policy and institutional developments, there are areas of both continuity and change. There has been a long tradition of government intervention that started in colonial times with the establishment of the Maize Control Board. These policies continued after independence with NAM Board. Since the 1980s, there have been several alternating periods of liberalisation and the reintroduction of controls. In 1989, President Chiluba introduced full-scale liberalisation and abolished NAM Board. But since the early 2000s, the trend has been towards greater interventionism. Many observers see the present role of the FRA as essentially a recreation of NAM Board. So to sum up, what are the main features of the political economy of agriculture in Zambia? What we have is a framework of policies that is focused mainly on the provision of private goods and neglectful of the provision of public goods that are needed for economic efficiency, growth and social welfare. The distortion of agricultural markets has created rents that benefit certain interest groups and generate identifiable winners and losers, as illustrated in the table below. What are the political and economic factors that explain this outcome? The study analyses a number of what we call foundational factors. These are long-term factors that are not easily amenable to change. 2 of the most important of these are illustrated here. The dominance of copper mining in the Zambian economy has created classic Dutch disease effects, drawing resources away from the agricultural sector and stymieing its growth and competitiveness. Because government and elite groups have easy access to copper revenues, there's been little political interest in developing agriculture, and agricultural policies in Zambia are often regarded as something of a welfare operation, rather than a strategy to boost growth and competitiveness. I've already mentioned the historical significance of maize and its central role in colonial policy and post-independence nation building. Following independence, maize farming became a symbol of modernization and overturning colonial inequities. Agricultural policies became the central part of a social contract, based around supporting the interests of smallholders while providing cheap food for Zambia's large urban population and mine workers. So maize has always been highly politicized, and public attitudes have supported the notion that government intervention is necessary and legitimate. Moving on to the institutional dynamics or the rules of the game. The distribution of power in the agricultural sector is essentially characterized by executive dominance. The study looks at various stakeholders in the sector who might provide a source of counterpower, but finds that these are generally of limited importance. One exception has been the Zambia National Farmers Union, with its huge membership and outreach, and contacts at the highest political levels. Institutions in the agricultural sector tend to operate more on the basis of personalized processes than adherence to publicly known, predictable, and transparent rules and procedures. The key policies seem to arise through the President and his political advisors' calculations on how they can best gain political support. Political competition clearly explains a lot of what's been going on. Rural voters were a vital part of the outgoing MMD party's political support base. There seem to have been two mechanisms at work. First of all, agricultural subsidies and the handouts that they represent could be seen as a way to buy rural votes directly. Secondly, the rents that have been created have benefited power brokers in rural areas like district commissioners and traditional chiefs, and these brokers play a key role in mobilizing votes. And this brings us to the here and now. I think it's important to emphasize how closely fought the 2011 elections were. And in this climate where every last vote counted, the government appears to have been willing to fund political patronage and private goods in agriculture to a massive extent, perhaps more than normal. Ultimately, this doesn't seem to have worked as a political strategy, and we'll come back to that. The two latest years of bumper crops have also been another important here and now factor that partly explain why FRA maize purchasing has got so far out of control. It's probably the case that the agency has been caught by surprise by the weather and has ended up having to buy far more maize than it had forecast. So where might change come from, and what are the actual and potential drivers of change? The election result and the victory of the Patriotic Front is clearly a hugely important factor. The Patriotic Front has a different political support base, which may mean that it's less influenced by the need to distribute patronage to rural populations through agricultural policies. The election result may also indicate a change in the behaviour of rural voters. It's possible that rural voters are becoming less susceptible to being bought off by handouts, and this could be the beginnings of an opportunity to build demand for agricultural public goods. It's widely recognised that the fiscal costs of present policies can't be sustained over the long term, and that at some point there's going to have to be a scaling down in subsidies and market intervention. Perhaps this pressure might come from other sectors competing for government funds. Wasteful agricultural subsidies can make an easy target for other resource users competing for a share of the budget. Taxpayer and consumer pressure don't appear to be important factors at present, but could potentially be. Private sector lobbying is already quite significant and could be more so if it were focused on issues surrounding public goods provision rather than serving narrow interests. Frustration within the public sector could be another important source of pressure for change. There are many experienced technical staff within the Ministry of Agriculture and Cooperatives who are quite disillusioned with the present policy focus and the Ministry's weak position. Potentially such voices could be an important constituency for change. Donor pressure in the agricultural sector is relatively modest, but is being used quite effectively through the common platform of the agriculture cooperation partners. Zambia has recently signed up to a CAADP compact, which could be an important driver of improved policy. And finally, processes of regional integration could also be extremely significant. Zambia has major food markets at its doorstep. Exploiting these effectively would require a shift in policy orientation, away from price intervention and towards making the public investments needed to support productivity and competitiveness. What conclusions can we draw about the potential for change or the space for reform in the sector? A scenario of incremental change is probably the most likely and achievable, but there are important differences between policy areas. The FRA is probably going to be easier to reform than the FISP, simply because the huge cost, waste and ineffectiveness of the scheme is so obvious. In more difficult policy areas like the Fertiliser Input Support Programme, there is scope to gradually chip away at subsidies and to introduce smarter forms of subsidies like e-vouchers. And it should be remembered that the agricultural sector is not all maize. Outside of maize, in subsectors like soybeans and livestock, where government is less present, there is immediate scope to support market development. I think it's quite helpful to think about what processes and accompanying measures might help reforms to succeed. Here I've identified 4. Firstly, I think demonstration effects will be important. The dynamism of the non-maize sector is important to show what can be achieved in a more liberalised policy environment. And introducing reforms on a pilot basis, like what's being now done with the e-vouchers, can also provide a powerful demonstration. The second point is about making information publicly available on policy performance. The work of the Food Security Research Unit demonstrates, I think, the persuasiveness of well-researched evidence on the effects of public policy. The importance of providing a compelling narrative came up in several of our workshops in Zambia. In engaging in policy dialogue, donors need to find ways to make policy reforms appeal to politicians rather than simply criticising what's gone wrong, and the paper identifies some opportunities in this regard. And finally, strengthening stakeholder voice will be crucial, particularly in areas where groups are currently disorganised, like consumers or taxpayers, and in brokering the kind of connections that will be needed for common interests to emerge. What does this all mean for development agencies working in the agriculture sector, the EC in particular? I think the foregoing analysis does make it clear that the agriculture sector is a tricky place to work. The major policy distortions do limit the areas where donors can usefully engage, so I think the EC has been quite right in designating agriculture as a non-focal sector in its country strategy paper. However, it does need to be ready to step up its engagement and levels of support if conditions improve. The large-scale policy distortions in the sector also seem to preclude a sector-wide approach. Indeed, the Agriculture Sector Investment Programme, the ASIP, that was launched more than a decade ago in a rather more conducive policy environment, was ultimately regarded as something of a disappointment. And since then, donors have essentially been cherry-picking and gap-filling, looking to fund useful projects in selected areas where opportunities do arise. This stance continues to be valid, but I think donors do need to be actively looking for ways to support broader and more joined-up initiatives. Donor interventions have tended to focus on the supply side of reform, working to build capacity within public sector bodies to formulate and implement policies. There is clearly a need to keep doing this, but I think we could definitely be doing more to support the various sources of demand for change that have been highlighted for this study. Donors have tended to place a lot of faith in capacity building in the public sector, and the results have been rather disappointing where they haven't addressed the broader systemic problems. I think in the light of this, it's very important that future programs like the EC's Performance Enhancement Programme for the Ministry of Agriculture and Cooperatives should focus particularly on systems building, introducing more rules-based administrative and financial systems, and looking for ways and mechanisms to promote greater public accountability and scrutiny. The EC does have a particular advantage in supporting processes of regional integration, and these have been identified as potentially being an important driver of change in the agriculture sector domestically. These opportunities need to be looked at and developed. Finally, I think this kind of analysis can help donors to engage in more productive policy dialogue, helping to better understand the political interests and incentives facing their counterparts, finding more compelling political narratives, and looking creatively to find ways to gradually expand the reform space. So that's a rather rapid summary of the analysis. Please do read the paper if you'd like to find out more, and please do comment on Capacity for Dev. Thank you for listening.